April Lady by Georgette Hare. Read by Eve Matheson. Chapter 1. There was silence in the book-room. Not the silence of intimacy, but a silence fraught with tension. My lady's blue eyes, staring across the desk into my lord's cool grey ones, dropped to the pile of bills under his hand. Her fair head was hung, and her nervous hands clasped one another tightly. In spite of a modish and very expensive morning dress of twilled French silk, and the smart crop achieved for her golden curls by the most fashionable coiffeur in London, she looked absurdly youthful, like a schoolgirl caught out in mischief. She was, in fact, not yet 19 years old, and she had been married for nearly a year to the gentleman standing on the other side of the desk, and so steadily regarding her. "Well?" She swallowed rather convulsively. The Earl had spoken quite gently, but her ears were quick to catch the note of implacability in his voice. She stole a scared look up at him, and dropped her eyes again, colouring. He was not frowning, but there was no doubt that he meant to obtain an answer to the quite unanswerable question he had put to his erring bride. Another silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the large clock on the mantelpiece. My lady gripped her fingers so tightly together that they whitened. "I asked you, Nell, why all these tradesmen," the Earl lifted the bills and let them fall again, "have found it necessary to apply to me for the settlement of their accounts." "I am very sorry," faltered the Countess. "But that doesn't answer my question," he said dryly. Well, I expect it was because I forgot to pay them myself." "Forgot?" Lower sank her golden head. She swallowed again. "Under the hatches yet again, Nell?" She nodded guiltily, her colour deepening. His expression was inscrutable, and for a moment he said nothing. His gaze seemed to consider her, but what thoughts were running in his head it would have been impossible to have guessed. "I appear to make you a very inadequate allowance," he observed. The knowledge that the allowance he made her was a very handsome one caused her to cast an imploring glance up at him and to stammer, "Oh, no, no." "Then why are you in debt?" "I have bought things which perhaps I should not," she said desperately. This gown, for instance. Indeed, I am sorry. I won't do so any more." "May I see your paid bills?" This was said more gently still, but it effectively drove the flush from her cheeks. They became as white as they had been before, red. To be sure, she had any number of receipted bills, but none knew better than she that their total, staggering though it might seem to the daughter of an impoverished peer, did not account for half of that handsome allowance which was paid quarterly to her bankers. At any moment now, my lord would ask the question she dreaded, and dared not answer truthfully. It came. "3 months ago, Nell," said the Earl, in a measured tone, "I forbade you most straitly to pay any more of your brother's debts. You gave me your word that you would not. Have you done so?" She shook her head. It was dreadful to lie to him, but what else was to be done when he looked so stern, and had shown himself so unsympathetic to poor Dysart? It was true that Dysart's recurring difficulties were all due to his shocking luck, and it seemed that Cardross couldn't understand how unjust it was to blame Dysart for his inability to abandon gaming and racing. That fatal tendency, said Mamma with resignation, ran in the family. Grandpapa had died under a cloud of debt, and Papa, with the hopeful intention of restoring the fortunes of his house, had still more heavily mortgaged his estates. This was why Papa had been so overjoyed when Cardross had offered for her hand. For Cardross was as well born as he was wealthy, and Papa had previously been obliged to face the horrid necessity of giving his eldest daughter to the highest bidder, even, dreadful thought, if this should prove to be a rich merchant with social aspirations. He had done so with great fortitude, and he had had his reward. In her very first season, indeed before she had been out a month, Cardross had not only seen the Lady Helen Irvine, but had apparently decided that she was the bride for whom he had so long waited. Such a piece of good fortune had never even occurred to Lord Pevensey. It was certainly to be supposed that Cardross, past 30, and with no nearer relation than a cousin to succeed him, must be contemplating marriage in the not-too-distant future. But such was his consequence that he might have had the pick of all the damsels faithfully presented by their mammas at the Queen's drawing-rooms, and thereafter exhibited by them at Almack's assembly-rooms and all the Tongue parties. Moreover, to judge by the style of the lady who was pretty generally known to be his mistress, his taste was for something older, and by far more sophisticated than a child fresh from the schoolroom. Never had Papa thought to see his little Nell do so well for the family. In the event, her success and Cardross's generosity proved to be rather too much for him. Hardly had he led his child to the altar than he suffered a stroke. The doctors assured his lady that he had many years of life before him, but the visitation had rendered him so far incapable that he had had to abandon his usual pursuits and to retire to the seclusion of his ancestral home in Devonshire, where it was the earnest, if unexpressed, hope of his wife and son-in-law he would be obliged to remain. Nell did not know just what Cardross had done to earn her parents' gratitude. It all came under the vague title of settlements, and she was not to bother her pretty head over it, but to take care always to conduct herself with dignity and discretion. Mamma, declaring herself to be deeply thankful, had made quite plain to her what her duty henceforward would be. It included such things as always showing my lord an amiable countenance, and never embarrassing him by asking ill-bred questions, or appearing to be aware of it if, perhaps, he was found to have formed a connection outside the walls of that splendid house of his in Grosvenor Square. "One thing I am sure of," had said Mamma, fondly patting Nell's hand, "and that is that he will treat you with the greatest consideration. His manners, too, are so particularly good that I am persuaded you will never have cause to complain of the sort of neglect or indifferent civility which is the lot of so many females in your situation. I assure you, my love, there is nothing more mortifying than to be married to a man who lets it be seen that his affections are elsewhere engaged." Mamma should have known, for this had been her fate. What Mamma did not know, and no one must ever guess, was that her carefully instructed daughter had tumbled headlong into love with my lord at their very first meeting, when Lady Jersey, one of the patronesses of Almack's, had brought him across the room to be introduced to her, and she had looked up into his eyes and had seen them smiling down at her. No, Mamma had no suspicion of that. Mamma was all sensibility, but she knew that marriage had nothing to do with romance. It had been her dread, she confided, that Nell would be married to a man whom she could not like, but she was quite sure that Nell must like so charming and so handsome a gentleman as Cardross, and, what was more, there could be little doubt that he was disposed to hold his bride in considerable affection. He had actually desired Lady Jersey to present him to her on that memorable evening, and what he had later said to Papa when he had made his offer had quite soothed a mother's anxiety. Nell would meet with nothing but courtesy and consideration at his hands. It hadn't seemed possible to Nell, lost in love, that Cardross could have proposed to her only because she was pretty and well-born, and rather more pleasing to him than any of the other young ladies who met his critical eye. But Mamma had been right. When Nell had met my lord's half-sister and ward, a vivid brunette, not then out, but hopeful of being presented by her sister-in-law, that impetuous damsel had exclaimed, warmly embracing her, "Oh, how pretty you are! Prettier by far than Giles's mistress! How famous if you were to put her nose out of joint!" It had been a dreadful shock, But Nell had not betrayed herself, which was some small consolation, and she was thankful to have been made aware of the truth before she could render herself ridiculous by showing her heart to the world, or have become a tiresome bore to my lord by hanging on him in the doting way which one short season had taught her was considered by the modish to be not at all the thing. As for putting Lady Auset's nose out of joint, it had not taken her long to discover the identity of my lord's mistress. That ambition probably belonged, like her earlier dreams, to the realm of make-believe, and certainly seemed very far from achievement today, when my lord was commanding her to account for her debts. "Tell me the truth, Nell." His voice, quite kind, but unmistakably imperative, recalled her from her hurrying, jumbled thoughts. But it was impossible to tell him the truth, because even if he forgave her for having disobeyed him, he was very unlikely to forgive Dysart, for whom, in his eyes, there could be no excuse at all. And if he refused to rescue Dysart from his difficulties any more, and made it impossible for her to do so either, what would become of Di, or, for that matter, of poor Papa? Not so long ago he had said, a trifle grimly, that the best turn he could render Dysart would be to buy him a pair of colours, and pack him off to join Lord Wellington's army in the Peninsula. And it was all too probable that this was precisely what he would do if this fresh disaster came to his ears. Nor was there much doubt that Dysart would jump at the offer, because he had always hankered after a military career. Only Papa, with his next son a schoolboy still at Harrow, had refused even to discuss the matter, and Mamma, at the mere thought of exposing her beloved eldest born to the dangers and discomforts of a military campaign, had suffered a series of distressing spasms. No, the truth could not be told. But how did one account for £300 with never a bill to show? There was no need for Lord Pevensy's daughter to cudgel her brains for more than a very few moments over that problem. Few knew better than an Irvine how money could vanish without leaving a trace behind. "It wasn't Dysart," she said quickly. "I'm afraid it was me." She saw his face change, an arrested look in his eyes, a hardening of the lines about his mouth, and she felt suddenly frightened. "Pray don't be angry," she begged, rather breathlessly. "I promise I will never do so any more." "Are you telling me you lost it at play?" She hung her head again. After a pause, he said, "I suppose I should have known that it would be in your blood, too." "No, no, indeed it isn't," she cried with passionate sincerity. "Only it seemed stupid and prudish not to play when everyone else did so, and then I lost, and I thought perhaps the luck would change, but it didn't, and—" "You need say no more," he interrupted. "There was never yet a gamester who didn't think the luck must change." He looked frowningly at her, and added in a level tone, "I should be very reluctant, Nell, to take such steps as must put it wholly out of your power to play anything but silver loo, or a pool at commerce. But I give you fair warning I will not permit my wife to become one of Pharaoh's daughters." "Well, I am not perfectly sure what that is," she said naively, "but indeed I won't do it again, so pray don't do anything horrid." "Very well," he replied. He glanced down at the bills on his desk. "I'll settle these and any others that you may have. Will you bring them to me, please?" "Now?" she faltered, uneasily aware of a drawer stuffed with bills. "Yes, now." He added with a smile, "You will be much more comfortable, you know, when you have made a clean breast of the whole." She agreed to this, but when she presently rendered up a collection of crumpled bills, she did not feel at all comfortable. There could be no denying that she had been woefully extravagant. The allowance Cardross made her had seemed so enormous to a girl who had never had anything to spend beyond the small sum bestowed on her with the utmost reluctance by her papa for pin money, that she had bought things quite recklessly, feeling her resources to be limitless. But now, as she watched my lord glance through the appalling sheaf, she thought she must have been mad to have spent so much and so heedlessly. For some moments he read with an unmoved countenance, but presently his brows knit, and he said, A 2-colour gold snuff-box with grisaille paintings. For Dysart, she explained apprehensively. Oh. He resumed his study of the incriminating bills. With a sinking heart, she saw him pick up a document headed in elegant scrollwork by the name of her favourite dressmaker. He said nothing, however, and she was able to breathe again. But an instant later he read aloud, "Singing bird with box embellished turquoise blue enamelled panels." "What the devil—" "It was a music box," she explained, her voice jumping, "for the children, my sisters." "I see," he said, laying the bill aside. Her spirits rose, only to sink again an instant later when the Earl exclaimed, "Good God!" Peeping in great trepidation to see what had provoked this startled ejaculation, she perceived that he was holding another scrolled sheet. 40 guineas for one hat, he said incredulously. "I'm afraid it was a little dear," she owned. It has 3 very fine ostrich plumes. You see, you said you liked it," she added desperately. "Your taste is always impeccable, my love. Did I like the other 8 hats you have purchased, or haven't I seen them yet?" Horrified, she stammered, "Not 8, Giles, surely." He laughed. 8? Oh, don't look so dismayed. I dare say they are all quite necessary. To be sure, 40 guineas seems a trifle extortionate, but it is certainly a charming confection, and becomes you delightfully." She smiled gratefully at him, and he took her chin in his hand and pinched it. "Yes, very well, ma'am, but that is only the sop that goes before the scold. You've been drawing the bustle disgracefully, my dear. You seem not to have the smallest notion of management, and I should doubt whether you have ever kept an account in your life. Now I am going to settle all these bills of yours, and I am also going to place a further £100 to your account. That should, indeed it must, keep you in reasonably comfortable circumstances until the quarter." She exclaimed, "Oh, thank you. How very kind you are. I will take the greatest care, I promise." "I trust you won't find it necessary to exercise any very stringent economies," he said with a touch of irony. "But if you have any more bills laid by, give them to me now. I won't scold, but I warn you, Nell, it won't do to keep your money safely in Childs while you run up debts all over town. There are to be no bills outstanding at the quarter, so if you are concealing any from me now, make a clean breast of them. If I found that you had deceived me, then indeed I should be angry with you, and do much more than scold." What would you do if I did happen to owe any money at the quarter?" she asked, looking frightened. "Give you only enough money for such trifling expenses as must occur from day to day, and arrange that all your bills are sent to me for payment," he replied. "Oh, no," she cried, flushing. "I assure you I should dislike it as much as you, and feel as much humiliated. But I have seen something of what such reckless spending as you appear to delight in may lead to, and I am determined it shall not happen in my household. Now think, Nell. Have you given me all your bills?" The consciousness of having already deceived him as much as his threat, coupled as it was by a certain look of inflexibility in his face, almost overpowered her. In suppressed agitation, which rendered calm reflection impossible, she said hurriedly, "Yes, oh, yes." "Very well. We shan't speak of this again, then." The flurry of her heart subsided. She said in a subdued voice, "Thank you. Indeed, I am very much obliged to you. I did not mean to be such an extravagant wife." "Nor I such a tyrannical husband. We could deal better than this, Nell." No, I mean I never thought you so. You are most kind. I beg your pardon for being so troublesome. Pray forgive me." "No." His hand was outstretched to her, but she did not take it, only smiling nervously and saying again, "Thank you. You are very good. Oh, how late it is. May I go now?" His hand fell. he said in a quite different voice. "I am not a schoolmaster. Certainly go, if that is your wish." She murmured something in disjointed phrases about his sister and Almack's and fled out of the room. That gesture, coming as it did at the end of a scene during which he had indeed seemed to be more schoolmaster than husband, seemed to her rather the expression of kindness than of any warmer emotion, and, with her nerves already overset, she had not been able to respond to it as, in general, she had forced herself to respond to any advance made by him. That her retreat might offend him, she knew. That it could wound him, she had no suspicion. Having, from the start of her married life, seen in his love-making only a chivalrous determination not to betray to her that, although he had bestowed his name on her, his heart belonged to another. As for Cardross, he was left with some rather bitter reflections to bear him company, and the growing suspicion that all the well-wishers who had begged him not to marry Nell had been right after all. No good could come of an alliance with an Irvine. One of his cousins, that pink of the ton, Mr. Felix Hethersett, had put the matter to him with brutal frankness. "Nothing to say against the girl, dear old boy, but I don't like the stable," had said Mr. Hethersett. Well, he had not liked the stable either. Nothing had been further from his intention than marriage with an Irvine, and nothing had seemed more improbable than a love-match. It was his duty to marry, but for some years he had enjoyed an agreeable connection with a fashionable lady of easy morals and skilful discretion, and that he should succumb to a pair of blue eyes and a mischievous dimple had been an event quite outside his calculations. But so it had been. He had first seen his Nell in a ballroom, and he had been instantly struck, not so much by her undeniable beauty as by the sweetness in her face and the innocence of her inquiring gaze. Before he well knew what had happened, his heart was lost, and every prudent consideration thrown to the winds. She sprang from a line of expensive profligates, but he had been ready to swear, looking into her eyes, that she had miraculously escaped the Irvine taint. She had been less than 18 when he had married her, 14 years younger than he, and when he found himself with a shy, elusive bride, he handled her very gently, believing that tenderness and forbearance would win for him the loving, vital creature he was so sure lived behind the nervous child. He had caught glimpses of that creature, or so he thought, but he had never won her, and the fear that he had deceived himself was beginning to grow on him. She was dutiful, even submissive, sometimes an entrancing companion, always a well-mannered one. But although she never repulsed his advances, she never courted them, or gave any sign that she could not be perfectly happy out of his company. Once installed in Grosvenor Square, she entered with apparent zest into every fashionable amusement, took her young sister-in-law into society, rapidly acquired a court of her own, and was by no means the sort of wife who constantly demanded her husband's escort. She was extravagant. He had today discovered that, like the rest of her family, she was a gamester, and what affection she had, she appeared to lavish on her little sisters, and on her scapegrace of a brother. There had been plenty of people to tell Cardross that Nell had accepted him for the sake of his wealth. He had not believed them, but he was beginning to wonder. In her precipitate retreat from his book-room, he saw only a spoilt child's desire to escape from a disagreeable schoolmaster, and never dreamed that she had fled because her feelings threatened to overcome her. She made for the shelter of her own apartments, hoping, since she needed a little time in which to compose herself, that she would not find her dresser already there. She did not. She found her sister-in-law instead, blithely engaged in trying on one of those 9 modish hats. The young Countess's apartments consisted of a spacious bedchamber and an adjoining room, known to the household as her dressing-room, but partaking more of the nature of a boudoir. My lord had had both rooms redecorated on the occasion of his marriage, nesting his bride in a tent bed with rose silk curtains upheld by cupids and garlands, and hanging her dressing-room with blue and silver brocade. In this frivolous bower, of which she was frankly envious, the Lady Letitia Merion was parading between various mirrors, very well pleased with her appearance, but unable to decide on the precise tilt at which the hat should be worn. She hailed her sister-in-law light-heartedly, saying, "Oh, I am glad you are come. I've been waiting for ever. Now, I do think this is a ravishing hat, only how should one wear it? Like this, or like this?" "Oh, don't," begged Nell involuntarily, unable to bear the sight of what had contributed to her late discomfiture. "Good gracious, what's the matter?" demanded Letty. "Nothing, nothing. I have the headache a little, that is all." She saw that Letty was staring at her, and tried to smile. "Pray don't be concerned, it is only... She could not go on, her voice being totally suspended by the tears she was unable to control. "Nell!" Letty flung off the ravishing hat, and ran across the room to put her arms round her sister. "Oh, pray don't cry. Has something dreadful happened?" "No, no, that is... I have been so wickedly extravagant." "Is that all?" "I collect Giles has been giving you a scold. Don't regard it. He will come about." "Was he very angry?" "Oh, no, but very much displeased. And indeed it was unpardonable of me," Nell said, drying her eyes. "But that was not the worst. I was obliged." She broke off, flushing, and added in a hurried tone, "I can't tell you. I shouldn't have said that. Pray don't regard it. I have been sadly heedless, but I shall hope to go on better now." "Did you wish to speak to me particularly?" "Oh, no. Only to ask you if I may wear your zephyr scarf this evening, if you shouldn't be needing it yourself. But if you are in a fit of the dismals, I won't tease you," said Letty handsomely. "Oh, yes, do wear it. In fact, you may have it for your own, for I am sure I can never bear to wear it again," said Nell tragically. "Never bear? Nell, don't be such a goose. Why, you went into transports when they showed it to you, and it cost you 30 guineas. "I know it did, and he saw the bill for it, and never spoke one word of censure, which makes me feel ready to sink." "For my part," said Letty candidly, "I should be excessively thankful for it. May I have it indeed?" "Thank you. It will be just the thing to wear with my French muslin. I had meant to try if I could persuade Giles to purchase one like it for me." "Oh, no, do not," exclaimed Nell, aghast. "No, I shouldn't think of doing so now that he has taken one of his pets," agreed Letty. "I am sure I never knew anyone so odious about being in debt. What shall you wear tonight? You haven't forgotten that Felix Heatherset is to escort us to Almack's, have you?" Nell sighed. "I wish we need not go." "Well, there's not the least occasion for you to go if you don't choose," said Letty obligingly. "You may send a note round to Felix's lodging, and as for me, I dare say my Aunt Thorne will be very willing to take me with her, and my cousin." This airy speech had the effect of diverting Nell's mind from her own iniquities. Upon his marriage, the Earl had removed his young ward from the care of her maternal aunt, and had taken her to live in his own house. Mrs. Thorne was a good-natured woman, but he could not like the tone of her mind, or feel that she had either the desire or the power to control his flighty half-sister. He had been startled to discover how casual was the surveillance under which Letty had grown up, how improper many of the ideas she had imbibed, and he was still more startled when she disclosed to him that, young as she was, she had already formed what she assured him was an undying attachment. Jeremy Allendale was a perfectly respectable young man, but although well-connected, he could not be thought an eligible husband for the Lady Letty Merion. He was employed at the Foreign Office, and although his prospects were thought to be good, his present circumstances were straitened. His widowed mother was far from affluent, and he had several young brothers and sisters for whose education he considered himself to be largely responsible. The Earl thought this fortunate, for although the young man conducted himself with the strictest propriety, he was plainly infatuated with Letty, and no dependence whatsoever, in her brother's opinion, could be placed on her discretion. Could she but gain control of her fortune, she was quite capable of persuading her lover to elope with her. In the event, he was wholly unable to support her, so that contingency seemed unlikely. Mr. Allendale received little encouragement to visit in Grosvenor Square, but whether from wisdom or from a dislike of enacting the tyrant, the Earl had never forbidden his sister to hold ordinary social intercourse with him. She would incur no censure by standing up for 2 dances with Mr. Allendale, but Nell was well aware that under the careless chaperonage of her aunt she would not stop at that. She guessed from Letty's ready acquiescence in her own desire to remain at home that evening that Mr. Allendale would be at Almack's, and she at once shook off her megrims and said that of course she would take Letty there. Mr. Allendale was indeed at Almack's, and for the 50th time Nell found herself wondering why it was that Letty had fallen in love with him. He was a well-made man, he was even good-looking, but his manners were too formal for ease, and his conversation was painstaking rather than amusing. He was certainly solid. Nell found him a little dull. Mr. Felix Heatherset, not mincing matters, said, "Fellow's a dead bore. Shouldn't think the affair would last." "No," agreed Nell, "but I must own that she has shown the greatest constancy, in spite of having been very much made up to ever since she came out. I did venture once to suggest to Cardross that perhaps it would not be such a very bad match after all, but he cannot like it, and will only say that if she is still of the same mind when she is a few years older, he will not then receive Mr. Allendale in an unfriendly spirit." "Throwing herself away," said Mr. Heatherset disapprovingly. "Dash it, cousin, very taking little thing, besides being an heiress. Not but what," he added as a thought occurred to him, "very understandable you should wish to see her safely tied up to someone. I dare say she's the deuce of a charge." "Oh, no, indeed she is not," Nell said, quite distressed. "How could you think I wished to be rid of her? I am only too happy to have her companionship." Much abashed, he begged pardon. His earlier strictures on her family notwithstanding, he was one of her more faithful admirers, and was generally recognized to be her cicisbeo in chief. She had other and more dazzling followers, but he was certainly her favourite, a circumstance which presented an enigma to the worldlings who never dreamed that the beautiful young countess had no taste for dalliance, but smiled on Mr. Heatherset because he was her lord's cousin. She treated him much as she treated her brother, an arrangement which suited him very well, since he was not, in fact, much of a lady's man, but attached himself to the court of some lady of rank and beauty as a matter of ton. A high stickler, Mr. Heatherset, precise to a pin, blessed with propriety of taste, an impeccable lineage, and a comfortable fortune. He was neither handsome nor articulate, but his dress was always in the first style of elegance. He could handle a team to perfection, was generally thought to be up to every rig and row in town, and had such obliging manners as made him quite the best liked of the Bond Street beaux. The gentlemen thought him a very good fellow, and the ladies valued him for 2 very excellent reasons. To be admired by him added to any female's consequence, and to possess his friendship was to enjoy not only the distinguishing notice of a man of the first stare of fashion, but the willing services of one whose good nature was proverbial. For the more adventurous ladies, the dashing chippers who damped their muslins to make them cling revealingly to their exquisite forms, painted their toenails with gilt, and lived perpetually on the brink of social disaster, there were many more attractive blades. But young Lady Cardross was not a member of this sisterhood, and, while she naturally did not wish to be so unfashionable as to own no devoted admirer, she took care not to encourage the pretensions of any of the notorious rakes who courted her. Mr. Heatherset could be depended on to gallant one uncomplainingly to quite the dullest party of the season, and there was no need to fear that the abandonment of formality would lead him to encroach on his position. He was neither witty nor talkative, but a certain shrewdness characterized him. His bow was perfection, and his grace in a ballroom unequalled. Even Letty, who said that his notions of propriety were quite Gothic, did not despise his escort when she went to Almack's. Almack's was abominably slow, of course, and its haughty patronesses by far too high in the instep, but any lady refused a voucher of admission to its sacred precincts must consider herself to be socially damned. To attend the assemblies gallanted by Mr. Heatherset assured for one the approval even of censorious Mrs. Drummond Burrell, and had been known to win for a perfectly insipid damsel a condescending smile from that odious Countess Leven. Nell was as much astonished as she was delighted to perceive, on arrival in King Street, that her graceless but beloved brother was rather inexpertly dancing the boulanger, with a quiet-looking girl for his partner. He explained to her presently that he had never been so taken in before. "Ah, you may well stare," he said, his angelic blue eyes kindling with indignation. She could not help laughing, but she said, "Oh, Di, what a wretch you are, when you wouldn't come with me, and said wild horses couldn't drag you here." "It wasn't wild horses," he replied darkly. "They couldn't have done it. It was old Mother Wenlock. Beckoned to me to come up to that antiquated landau-let of hers in Bond Street this morning, and said I must dine in Brook Street to meet her niece. Of course I said I was engaged with a party of friends, but I might as well have spared my breath. Of all devilish things, Nell, these shocking old hags who are hand-in-glove with Mamma are the worst. Mind, if I'd known she meant to drag me to Almack's, she could have said what she chose. I wouldn't have budged. I ain't a dancing man. You can't get a thing to drink but lemonade and orgeat, and of the two, damned if I'd not as lief drink lemonade. And this precious niece, whom she swore was a ravishing girl, is nothing but a dowdy." "Ought to have known she would be," said Mr. Heatherset from the depths of his worldly wisdom. "Why?" demanded the Viscount. In other company, Mr. Heatherset would have answered him with brutal frankness, but under Nell's innocently inquiring gaze his courage failed, and he said he didn't know. After all, one couldn't tell an adoring sister that no chaperone in her senses would invite Dysart to gallant a ravishing girl to a party. If the damsel in question seemed likely to attract his roving fancy, she would be much more likely to forbid him the house. He might be the heir to an earldom, but it was common knowledge that his noble father, until he had the good fortune to catch Cardross for his daughter, was all to pieces, having, in vulgar parlance, brought an abbey to a grange. And no one who had observed his own volatile career could place the slightest dependence on his setting the family affairs to rights by more prudent conduct. So far from being regarded as an eligible bachelor, he was considered to be extremely dangerous, for he combined with decidedly libertine propensities a degree of charm which might easily prove the undoing of the most delicately nurtured female. He was also very good-looking, and although his critics unequivocally condemned the carelessness of his attire, it could not be denied that his tall person, with its fine shoulders and its crown of waving golden hair, inevitably drew all eyes. He had an endearing smile, too, at once rueful and mischievous. It dawned now, for he was no fool, and he knew very well what Mr. Heatherset had meant. "Craven!" he said challengingly. But Mr. Heatherset refused to be drawn, and since Letty came up at that moment, under the escort of Mr. Allendale, Dysart allowed the matter to drop. He greeted Letty with the easy camaraderie of one who was in some sort related to her, and at once begged permission to lead her into the set which was just then forming. However unalterably devoted to Mr. Allendale Letty might be, she was by no means impervious to the Viscount's charm, and she went blithely off with him, leaving her swain to exchange civilities with Nell. Her cousin Felix watched these proceedings with a jaundiced eye. It would have been hard to have found a greater contrast than that which existed between Lord Dysart and Mr. Jeremy Allendale. The one was a rather thick-set young man, whose grave eyes and regular features were allied to a serious mind and solid worth of character. The other was a tall, handsome buck, bearing himself with careless arrogance, laughter never far from his lips, and in his gleaming blue eyes a reckless light which sprang from a disposition which was as volatile as Mr. Allendale's was dependable. But in one respect they were blood brothers. As prospective bridegrooms, each in his way was wholly ineligible. Mr. Hethersett, watching the start of a promising flirtation between Letty and his lordship, was much inclined to think that he had grossly failed in his duty towards Cardross. A quicker-witted man, he gloomily reflected, would have intervened before Letty had had time to accept Dysart's invitation. Nell, too, was watching the couple on the dance-floor, not with misgiving, for although she knew that Cardross had no great liking for Dysart, she also knew that Letty had no great liking for anyone but her Jeremy, but a little wistfully. When she had seen Dysart, she had known an impulse to confide her troubles to him. She had no expectation of his being able to give back to her the money she had so blithely bestowed on him, but at least she might have warned him not, in future, to depend on her. There was no further opportunity offered her for speech with Dysart. Her own hand was claimed, her place in the set was far removed from Dysart's, and by the time she left the floor he had restored Letty to Mr. Heathersett's protection and had returned to his own party. He left it, on the flimsiest of excuses, 10 minutes later, a circumstance of which she was soon made fully aware by his hostess, who sailed across the room for the express purpose of favouring her with her opinion of his manners and upbringing. Mr. Hethersett could do nothing to spare her this ordeal, but when one of his and Cardross's more formidable aunts conceived it to be her duty to censure Nell for her thoughtlessness in permitting Letty to dance with Mr. Allendale, he came out strongly in her support, even recommending Lady Chudley to address her criticisms to Cardross himself. "Let me assure you, Felix," said the lady in quelling accents, "that nothing is further from my intentions. Far be it from me to seek to make mischief." "Just as well," responded the intrepid Mr. Hethersett. "Very likely to give you one of his set-downs." Nell was quite overcome by such a display of heroism on her behalf, but Mr. Hethersett disclaimed heroism. Having watched through a quizzing glass which hideously magnified his eye the retreat of the dowager, he assured Nell that he had spoken nothing more than the truth. "No need to fear Cardross would listen to her tales," he said. "What's more, he must know you couldn't stop Letty dancing with anyone. Doubt whether he could do it himself." It seemed as though the Earl shared this doubt. He had not returned from a dinner given by the Sublime Society of Beefsteaks when the ladies were set down in Grosvenor Square some time after midnight, but he visited his bride later in the morning. He found her with a breakfast tray across her knees, the curtains of her bed drawn back in billowing folds of rosy silk. She was engaged, between sips of coffee and nibbles at a slice of bread and butter, in reading her correspondence. This seemed, from the litter on the counterpane, to consist largely of gilt-edged invitations, but there was a letter crossed and recrossed from her mamma, which she was trying to decipher when Cardross came into the room. She put it down at once, and tried to tuck back the ringlets which had strayed from under her becoming nightcap of muslin and lace. "My lord! Oh, dear, I did not think you would be coming to see me so early. I am dreadfully untidy." "Don't," he said, capturing her hand and kissing it. "You look charmingly, I assure you. Was it amusing, your party?" "Yes, thank you. That is, it was just one of the assemblies at Almack's, you know." "Not very amusing, then," he remarked, seating himself upon the edge of her bed and picking up one of the invitation cards. "Nor will this be, but we shall be obliged to accept it, I suppose. She's Letty's godmother. Did Letty behave with propriety last night, or did she hang on that fellow Allendale the whole evening?" "No, indeed she did not. She stood up only twice with him." "I am astonished to learn that she had as much moderation, and I make you my compliments. It must surely be your doing.
Well, of course, I should try to dissuade her from doing what you don't like, said Nell doubtfully, but it wasn't at all necessary. Mr. Allendale's scruples are so very strict that I am persuaded he would never ask her to do anything that might set up people's backs.
Good God, said his lordship, what a slow top. My dear, what does she see in him to hit her fancy?
I can't think, said Nell candidly, though I am sure he has many excellent qualities and a most superior understanding.
Superior fiddlesticks! I never found him to be anything but a dreadful bore. I wish to God she would recover from this green sickness. It's quite impossible, you know. He has neither fortune nor expectation, and I'll swear I never saw a couple less suited to one another. I should be a villain to countenance such an attachment. If his scruples are as strict as you tell me, I collect I've no need to fear he may run off with her to Gretna Green.
Good gracious, no! Nell exclaimed, startled.
So much, then, for my Aunt Chudley's croakings.
Your Aunt Chudley? Oh, Giles, she was at Almack's last night, and she gave me a terrible scold for permitting Letty to dance with Mr. Allendale.
What impertinence!
Oh, no. Though that is what Felix said. And also he told her to make her complaints to you, which was not very civil of him, but excessively brave, I thought.
I wonder what she imagines I can do to stop Letty, short of incarcerating her at Merrion. By the by, I must go to Merrion next week. Useless, I suppose, to ask you to go with me.
She showed him a face of sudden dismay. Next week? But the Beedings masquerade!
He raised his brows. Is it so important? For my part, masquerades at Chiswick.
No, indeed, but you did promise Letty she should attend it. It is the first she has ever been to, and she has had the prettiest domino made, and I must own I think it would be dreadfully shabby to tell her now that she cannot go.
Hang Letty, can't she... No, I suppose not. Very well. I won't tease you to go with me.
I wish I might, she said wistfully. He smiled at her, but rather quizzically, and picked up another of the invitation cards.
A quadrille ball at the Coopers. How dashing! It will be a horrible squeeze. Must we go?
The post had brought her ladyship a polite reminder from Mr. Warren, perfumier, that a trifling account for scent, white nail-wax, and Olympian dew was outstanding. It had lain hidden by Lady Cooper's invitation, and was revealed when the Earl picked this up. Only a few guineas were involved, but Nell instinctively put out her hand to cover it. The movement caught his eye. He glanced down, and she at once removed her hand, flushing, vexed with herself.
"What other delights are in store for us?" he asked, picking up another card. "Assemblies and balls seem to be in full feather. You'll be knocked up by all this raking. Don't drag me to this affair, I beg of you."
"That? Oh, no, it is to be a petticoat party. You will be present at our own dress party, won't you?"
"Of course."
There was a short silence. After that one glance, the Earl had not again looked at Mr. Warren's account, but it seemed to his guilty wife imperative to divert his attention from it. She said, a trifle breathlessly, "Cardross, what a very elegant dressing-gown that is. I think I never saw you wear it before."
"Ah, I hoped you would be pleased with it," he replied blandly, "and with me for letting you see it."
"How absurd you are! It is certainly most handsome."
"Yes, and wickedly dear as your feathered bonnet, though not, I fear, as becoming. You see how I lay myself open to strong counter-attack."
"Oh, Giles!"
He laughed and tickled her cheek. "Foolish little Nell. Is it very shocking?"
She heaved a sigh of relief, smiling shyly at him. "No, indeed it isn't, only it does chance to be a bill I had forgotten, and I was afraid that you would be angry with me."
"What a disagreeable husband I must be," he murmured ruefully. "Shall I pay that bill with the rest?"
"No, please, it is a very small one. Look." She held it out to him, but he did not look at it, only taking her hand in his, the bill crushed between his fingers, and saying, "You mustn't be afraid of me. I never meant to make you so. I'll pay this bill or any other, only don't conceal any from me."
"Afraid of you? Oh, no, no," she exclaimed.
His clasp on her hand tightened. He leaned forward as though he would have kissed her. But her dresser came into the room just then, and although she quickly withdrew, the moment had passed. Nell had snatched her hand away, vividly blushing, and the Earl did not try to recapture it. He got up, his own complexion rather heightened, feeling all the embarrassment natural to a man discovered at 10 o'clock in the morning, making love to his own wife, and went away to his dressing-room. Chapter 2. Shortly before 4 o'clock that afternoon, young Lady Cardross's barouche was driven into Hyde Park by the Stanhope Gate. It was a very stylish vehicle, quite the latest thing in town carriages, and it had been bestowed on her ladyship, together with the pair of perfectly matched greys that drew it, by her husband upon her installation as mistress of his house in Grosvenor Square. "Slap up to the Echo," was what Dysart called it. Certainly no other lady owned a more elegant turnout. To be seen in Hyde Park between the hours of 5 and 6 on any fine afternoon during the London season, driving, riding, or even walking, was de rigueur for anyone of high fashion. And before her marriage, when she had sat beside her mamma in an old-fashioned landaulet, Nell had frequently envied the possessors of more dashing equipages, and had thought how agreeable it would be to sit behind a pair of high steppers in a smart barouche with its wheels picked out in yellow. She had been delighted with the Earl's gift, exclaiming naively, "Now I shall be all the crack." "Do you wish to be?" he had asked her, amused.
"Yes," she replied honestly, "and I think I ought to be, because although Miss Willoughby, our governess, you know, says that it is wrong to set one's mind on worldly things, you are all the crack, which makes it perfectly proper, I think, for me to be fashionable too."
"I am persuaded," he said, his countenance admirably composed, "that Miss Willoughby must perceive it to be your duty, even." She was a little dubious about this, but happily recollecting that she was no longer answerable to her governess, she was able to put that excellent educationist out of her mind.
"You know how people talk of Lord Dorset on his white horse and Mrs. Toddington with her chestnuts," she said confidentially. "Now they will talk of Lady Cardross behind her matched greys. I shouldn't be astonished if my barouche were to draw as many eyes as hers."
"Nor should I," agreed his lordship, grave as a judge. "In fact, I should be much astonished if it did not."
Whether it was the smart turnout which drew all eyes, or its charming occupant, Nell had soon experienced the felicity of attracting a great deal of attention when she drove in the park. She became a noted figure, and never doubted that she owed this triumph to her splendid horses, until her more knowledgeable sister-in-law remarked chattily, as she stepped into the carriage that day, "Isn't it a fortunate circumstance, Nell, that you are fair and I am dark? I don't wonder at it that everyone stares to see us. We take the shine out of all the other females. Mr. Bottisham told Hardwicke so, and Hardwicke says it is a compliment well worth having, because Mr. Bottisham is in general quite odiously censorious. I think," she added, dispassionately considering the matter, "that you are prettier than I am, but, on the other hand, I have a great deal of countenance, besides being dark, which is more in the mode, so I don't excessively mind your being beautiful." Nell could not help laughing, but, with Miss Willoughby's precepts in mind, she ventured to suggest to Letty that such candour was a trifle improper. "That is the sort of thing Aunt Chudley says," observed Letty, unabashed. "For my part, I see nothing improper in speaking the truth. And you can't deny that it is the truth." She made herself comfortable beside Nell, and unfurled a pink sunshade. "We make a perfect picture," she said complacently. "I collect Lord Hardwicke told you so." "Everyone tells me so."
Well, take care they don't next tell you that you are abominably conceited, recommended Nell. They won't, asserted Letty with confidence. No one I care a fig for, at all events. I dare say Felix might, for I never knew anyone so stuffy.
However, when they presently saw Mr. Heatherset strolling in the park, there was nothing to be read in that stickler's countenance but critical appreciation. Nell directed her coachman to pull up his horses, and when Mr. Heatherset came up to the carriage, leaned forward to give him her hand. "How do you do? I hoped we might see you. Do you mean to go to the Beedings masquerade next week? Cardross has been obliged to cry off. Isn't it infamous of him? Will you dine with us and give us your escort in his stead?" He looked regretful and shook his head. "Can't," he said mournfully. "Excused myself to Mrs. Beeding. Told her I had another engagement. Not the thing to go there after that. Pity." She smiled. "You cannot hoax me into believing that you think so. Confess, you dislike masquerades." "Not trying to hoax you. Happy to escort you anywhere. Not but what it ain't the sort of party I like. If I were you, I'd cry off because you won't enjoy it. Not just in your style."
"I declare you are the stupidest creature, Felix," Letty broke in. "Why shouldn't we enjoy it? It will be rare mummery, for we are all to wear masks and—"
"Yes, a vast rout of people and rompings," interrupted Mr. Heatherset in a tone of deep disapproval. "You may enjoy it. I never said you wouldn't. All I said was, Lady Cardross won't. You want a piece of advice, cousin?"
"No," said Letty crossly.
"Mistake," he said, shaking his head. "Not saying that ain't an elegant gown, it is. Not saying that hat don't become you, it does." He left an ominous pause, during which Letty eyed him uneasily. She might despise him for what she considered his antiquated notions of propriety, but no aspirant to high fashion could afford to ignore his pronouncements on all matters of sartorial taste. He delivered his verdict. "I don't like those pink ribbons, or the feather. Insipid."
"Insipid!" she exclaimed indignantly. She cast a glance down at the double row of pink knots which ornamented her dress of delicate fawn-coloured muslin. They exactly matched the feather that hung down on one side of a little straw hat which was turned up on the other side and worn at a dashing angle on her glossy black ringlets. French kid gloves of the same pink completed a toilet which she had thought to be, until this painful moment, in the first crack of the mode. Doubt now entered her soul. She turned her anxious gaze upon her cousin. "It isn't. You're saying it to vex me."
"No wish to vex you. Just thought you wanted to be up to the knocker."
"I do. I am up to the knocker."
"Not with those pink bows," said Mr. Heatherset firmly. "Quite pretty, but dashed commonplace. Ought to be cherry. Give you a new touch." With these words he made his bow to both ladies and proceeded on his way, leaving his cousin torn between wrath and a growing conviction that he was right, and Nell a good deal amused.
"If Felix were not related to me, I should cut his acquaintance," said Letty, glaring vengefully after him. "He is prosy and uncivil, besides placing himself on far too high a form. And now I come to think of it, I didn't above half like his waistcoat." She transferred her gaze to Nell as Mr. Heatherset's exquisitely tailored person receded in the distance. "If he thinks my ribbons insipid, I am astonished that he hadn't the effrontery to say that your dress was commonplace. Depend upon it, he thinks you would look more becomingly in purple or puce or scarlet. Odious creature!" "Oh, he couldn't say that to me, when he told me weeks ago never to wear those strong colours," said Nell, whose gown of Berlin silk was just the colour of her eyes. "That was when I was wearing that maroon pelisse. I promise you he was quite as odious to me. Don't regard it." "I never pay the least heed to a word he says," replied Letty in a lofty voice. She relapsed into thoughtful silence while the barouche proceeded on its way, but said after several minutes, "Do you think I should tell my woman to dye this feather, or purchase a new one?" "Dye that one," responded Nell, "and also the ribbons." "I wish he might have gone with us to the masquerade. It would have been much more comfortable. I suppose—" She hesitated, looking doubtfully at Letty. "I suppose you would not like to go to Marian with Cardross instead?" "Nell!" almost shrieked Letty, an expression of scandalized dismay on her countenance. "Go to Marian in the middle of the season! You must be out of your senses. And if that is what Giles wishes us to do, I think it is the shabbiest thing I ever heard of, when he promised I should go to the masquerade. Yes, and after fobbing me off with this when I particularly wanted to go to the Covent Garden masquerade," she said indignantly, "saying it was not the thing and we should go to the Beedings' private masquerade instead, just like him. I dare say, if I only knew—" "It is not just like him, and I wish you will not fly into a pet for nothing," said Nell, firing up. "If you only knew, he said not another word to persuade me to go with him to Marian when I reminded him that you particularly wished to go to the masquerade. And if Felix hadn't failed—" "But, Nell, it is of no consequence," Letty urged. "I am sure quite 50 of our friends are going to it, and even if we found ourselves amongst strangers it still wouldn't signify, because Mrs. Beeding is your cousin. I own it would be more comfortable to take some gentleman along with us, but you may easily invite Westbury or Sir George Marlowe or—" "No," said Nell emphatically, "not to a masquerade." Letty uttered a tiny spurt of laughter. "Are you afraid they wouldn't keep the line?" "For my part, I think it would be very good fun if they did flirt outrageously with us." "But you are the oddest creature. Not up to snuff at all, in spite of having come out a whole year before I did. Why, at my very first ball—" She broke off, as Nell nipped her arm, directing her eyes to the servants on the box of the carriage. "Oh, stuff! No, don't be cross. I won't say a word, I promise. How would it be if we took Jeremy with us? I dare say he would be very glad to go, and you may be sure he would conduct himself with all the propriety in the world, because even Giles owns that he is perfectly the gentleman." "Don't be so absurd," begged Nell. "He told you himself that he hadn't received an invitation, and I can readily believe that he has too much propriety to go to the party without one. Besides, you know very well that I wouldn't invite him when it is what Giles would particularly dislike." Letty accepted this rebuff philosophically, saying in a resigned tone, "No, I didn't think you would. Well, what is to be done?" "Pray don't say you cannot go if Giles does not, for of all the dowdy notions—" Nell flushed. "No such thing. I mean, I haven't the remotest intention of saying such a thing, only I can't immediately think of any gentleman who might—" She stopped, as her troubled gaze alighted on 2 horsemen riding easily towards them. Her eyes brightened. She exclaimed, "Dysart! The very man!" declared Letty enthusiastically. "Now you may be easy." This optimism, however, seemed for several minutes to have been ill-founded. The Viscount, who was bestriding a nervous young blood-chestnut few men would have cared to exercise in the park at an hour when it was thronged with traffic, responded readily enough to his sister's signal, bringing his reluctant mount up to the barouche and holding it there with all the apparent ease of an accomplished horseman. But when she asked him if he had received an invitation to the Beedings' masquerade, he replied, "Aye, but I don't mean to go." "Oh, Di, you didn't refuse," Nell said anxiously. "No, I didn't refuse, precisely," admitted Dysart, whose careless practice it was to leave all but a few favoured invitations unanswered. "Here, Corny, don't have to introduce you to my sister, do I? Or to Lady Letitia?" His companion, who had been holding coyly aloof, edged his horse forward, raising the low-crowned beaver from his head and bowing slightly to both ladies. Mr. Cornelius Fancourt was a chubby-faced young gentleman, slightly junior to the Viscount, whose devoted follower he had been ever since the pair had met at Harrow. There he had been privileged to lend his aid to his dazzling friend in various harebrained exploits. Later, he had been of invaluable assistance in disposing suitably of the statue of Mercury in the quad at Christchurch. And if he had never, either when up at Oxford or since both had come down from that seat of learning, contrived to rival Dysart's more celebrated feats, which included putting a donkey to bed with a complete stranger in an inn, and leaping one of his hunters over a dining table equipped with a full complement of plate, silver, glasses, and chandeliers, he had won for himself, besides the reputation of being one who never refused a wager, considerable fame for having walked the length of Piccadilly on a pair of stilts, and for having won a bet that he would journey to Dover and back again to London before his too hopeful challenger had made 1,000,000 dots on sheet after sheet of paper. Unlike his noble friend, he was possessed of a handsome fortune, and was unencumbered by any kin more nearly related to him than several aunts, to whose admonitions he paid no heed at all, and various cousins whom he had no hesitation in condemning as a parcel of slow-tops. His habit proclaimed the sporting man, but a hankering after dandyism was betrayed by buckram-wadded shoulders to his lavishly corded and tasselled Polish coat, and a Brummel tie round his rather short neck. The life and soul of a convivial party at Long's Hotel or Limmer's, he was apt to be tongue-tied in the presence of ladies, and might be looked for in vain at Almack's assembly rooms. He was sufficiently well acquainted with Nell to feel no particular alarm when she addressed him, but a quizzing glance from Letty's mischievous eyes threw him at once into stuttering disorder. Observing this, the Viscount, with his customary lack of ceremony, recommended that enterprising damsel to pay no heed to him. "Not in the petticoat line," he explained. "Are you going to this precious masquerade, Nell?" "Yes, indeed we are, only we find ourselves in a little fix. Cardross has been obliged to cry off, you see, and it is so disagreeable to go to such affairs with no gentleman to escort one, and Felix cannot go with us either, so, if you please, Di, will you be so obliging as to—" "No, dash it, Nell," interrupted the Viscount hastily, "not to a masquerade out at Chiswick. Ask Marlowe or Westbury or another of your flirts. The Lord knows you've plenty of 'em. Why choose me?" "She is afraid they wouldn't keep the line," said Letty demurely. Before the Viscount could reply, Mr. Fancourt, rather unexpectedly, entered into the discussion. "Shouldn't wonder at it if she was right," he said. "Masquerades, you know, ramshackle. Ought to go with her ladyship." "What the deuce do you know about masquerades, Corny?" demanded Dysart. "You never went to one in your life." "Yes, I did," asserted Mr. Fancourt. "I went to one with you, Di. Well, I wouldn't let my sister go to one alone. What I mean is, I wouldn't if I had one. Had a sister, I mean," he added, becoming a little flustered, as Letty giggled. "Covent Garden!" exclaimed Dysart scornfully. "I should think not, indeed. But this affair will be quite another thing. Pretty insipid, I should think. Why do you go to it?"
"You see, it is the first masquerade Letty has attended, and so she wishes particularly to go," Nell explained. "Yes, and what is more, I am quite determined to go," corroborated Letty. "I collect you don't mean to be so obliging as to escort us, which doesn't surprise me above a very little, because of all imaginable persons I think brothers to be by far the most disagreeable." "Letty, that is not just," exclaimed Nell. "You have no cause to say so, and I assure you I have none either." She smiled lovingly up at the Viscount. "Don't come if you had rather not. At my cousin's party I can't need an escort, after all." However, the Viscount, either from perversity or from a sense of obligation, said, with a darkling look at Letty, that if his sister was set on attending the masquerade, he would certainly accompany her.
He added, with an austerity which accorded ill with his rakish appearance, that if it suited Cardross's notions of propriety to allow Nell to go alone to such parties, that was where he must join issue with his lordship. He then, most unhandsomely, rode off before either lady could counter this charge. Nell was merely distressed that he should think her husband neglectful, but Letty, who reserved to herself the right to criticise Cardross, was extremely incensed, and charged Mr. Fancourt, lingering to make his adieu in form, with a rude message to him. "Though, to be sure, I don't know why I should put myself to the trouble of fighting Giles's battle," she observed, as Mr. Fancourt left them, and Nell told her coachman to drive on. "I am persuaded he would never fight mine." She encountered a very direct look from Nell's soft blue eyes. Nell said quietly, "You must not say so. It is quite untrue, and you know it." Letty sighed. "Well, I didn't mean precisely that, but you must own that no one was ever more unsympathetic than Giles. It is so unkind of him to take poor Jeremy in aversion. I had not believed he could be so proud, or care so much for consequence, or so little for my happiness." "It isn't that. Indeed it is not, Letty. He doesn't dislike Mr. Allendale, and as for caring about his consequence, you know he has said that if you are still of the same mind in a year or two, he will not then refuse his consent. It is your happiness which he thinks of. I don't say that he likes the match, for although Mr. Allendale's situation in life is respectable, he is not your equal in station, and there is a disparity between your fortunes which makes the marriage even more ineligible." "That is just what I have no patience with," Letty said quickly. "If I were poor too, it would be another matter. I don't mean to say that I shouldn't wish to marry Jeremy, for I should, but there would then be justice in Cardross's objection. It is a melancholy reflection, Nell, but I fear I shouldn't be a very good wife for a man in straitened circumstances. Of course I should endeavour to learn how to manage, but it is useless to deceive oneself. I don't think I have any turn for economy." "No, alas, nor I," agreed Nell, with a wry grimace. "The thing is, we were not bred to it," said Letty profoundly. "But what does it signify, after all, when I shall be the mistress of a substantial fortune as soon as I come of full age?" "I think the thing is that Cardross feels you are too young to be making up your mind just yet," Nell said diffidently. "Depend upon it, he would not say so if I wanted to marry a man of rank and fortune," Letty said, her eyes kindling. "He did not think you too young when he offered for you, and I dare swear your papa did not either." "No," admitted Nell. "No? But if he had not been Cardross, your papa would have said so, even though he came of a very good family, and was in all respects a most superior man. It is all pride and pretension, and for my part I think it is detestable." No, not that, not quite that," Nell said. "I suppose he would wish you to make what is called a good match, but he has told me himself that if you are still of the same mind in a year or two, he knows very well that in a year or two, and probably much sooner, Jeremy will have been sent abroad. Indeed, Jeremy has the greatest hope, if all goes as he has reason to expect. But I mustn't tell you. Pray don't repeat it, Nell. He particularly desired me not to speak of it while nothing is yet settled." She hesitated, and then slid an impulsive hand into Nell's, and whispered, "One thing I must tell you. I believe, I hope, that he will shortly be calling in Grosvenor Square to see Cardross. You may guess for what purpose. I should not be mentioning to you, but oh, Nell, you will stand our friend, won't you?" "Well, I might," said Nell, in whom a year's intimacy with her sister-in-law had engendered a good deal of caution. "But not if you mean to do something outrageous." "Nothing of the sort," declared Letty indignantly. "Unless, of course, Cardross drives me to it, and that I depend on you to prevent." "Oh, pray don't," begged Nell, alarmed. "If he won't consent to your marriage, it is because he feels it would be wrong in him to do so. And how could I overcome such scruples, or or even wish to overcome them. If only you will be a little patient. Once Cardross is satisfied that your affections are truly fixed, when that day dawns, if it ever does, Jeremy may be thousands of miles distant." Letty interrupted. "I shall have nothing to do then but to continue in patience until he returns to England. If he does return. But naturally he will return." "Yes, but would you wager a groat on his doing so alone?" Letty retorted. "I would not. I don't mean to say that he does not love me as much as I love him, but if he does not set eyes on me for years, besides being made up to by, I dare say, a dozen girls or more, it would be wonderful indeed if he escaped being snatched up into matrimony with another." Nell could find nothing to say. Her imagination boggled at the picture of Mr. Allendale being courted by a dozen, or even half a dozen, girls, but she prudently kept this reflection to herself, only venturing to ask, after a slight pause, "What made you fall in love with him, Letty? I don't mean to say that he is not very amiable and civil, but... "I know precisely what you mean," said Letty, with unexpected cordiality, "and I haven't the smallest conjecture. If he had been like your brother, no one would have wondered at it in the least. I shouldn't myself. I assure you I am quite as much surprised as anyone, for it is not as if I had never met with any other gentleman. When I lived with my aunt, I met everyone who came to the house, for she was not at all stuffy, you know, and didn't even try to keep Selina and me in the schoolroom. We knew all Maria's and Fanny's beaux, and some of them were pretty dashing, I can tell you, only I never had the smallest tendre for any of them until I met Jeremy. I don't know how it was. That's me quite in a puzzle." She bestowed a dazzling smile upon a natty young gentleman in a sporting curricle who was trying to attract her attention. "Now, if I had formed an attachment to him, Cardross would have had cause to be cross," she observed. "In fact, when you consider, Nell, the lures that are for ever being thrown out to me by all the most shocking court cards on the town on account of my being an heiress, I think it astonishing that Cardross should not be thankful my interest has been fixed by a man of principle and character. And if he supposes that Jeremy loves me for my fortune, he much mistakes the matter." Cardross did not suspect Mr. Allendale of fortune-hunting, but when the promised visit was paid him a few days later, he received his sister's suitor with a cool civility that gave little promise of a yielding disposition. Mr. Allendale was not a nervous man, but it was with considerable reluctance that he presented himself in Grosvenor Square. He prided himself on his level judgment, and although he did not set his own worth low, every objection Cardross could raise to his pretensions was felt by him and acknowledged to be just. His love for Letty bordered, in the opinion of his mother, on infatuation, but it had needed much persuasion from her to induce him to make Cardross a formal offer for her hand. The disparity between them of rank and fortune weighed heavily upon his spirit. He had felt from the outset that his suit was hopeless, and that his wiser course would be to keep out of Letty's way and try to put her from his mind. Unfortunately, noble resignation was not a virtue which in any way attracted Letty. When he spoke of parting, she first burst into tears, which unmanned him, and then accused him of wanting to be rid of her, which made him utter some very ill-advised vows of eternal fidelity. After that there was no more talk of renunciation. Mr. Allendale did indeed speak sometimes of waiting, but with this plan also Letty was out of sympathy, and since he had never desired anything so passionately in the whole of his well-ordered life as to marry her, he allowed himself to become infected with her optimism, and even began to think that perhaps Cardross might not prove so inimical to his suit after all, if he were approached in a manly and straightforward way. This confidence, never very strong, waned as he trod up the steps of Cardross House, and wholly deserted him while he waited for the Earl in the book-room. His appearance was always characterized by a neatness and a propriety of taste, which struck the happy mean between the man of fashion and the man of affairs, and he had spent more time than usual that morning on the arrangement of his neckcloth. But as the clock on the high mantelpiece rather aggressively ticked away the minutes, he became convinced that the faint stripe in his toilinette waistcoat made him look like a park saunterer, that his coat of sober blue cloth was too tightly moulded to his form, and that by brushing his mouse-coloured hair into the Brutus style affected by Mr. Brummel, he had committed a gross error of judgment. Cardross would probably suspect him of aping the fashions of the dandy set. However, when the Earl at last came into the room, he did not appear to notice what by this time amounted in Mr. Allendale's mind to the blatant vulgarity of his waistcoat. On the other hand, his handsome, impassive countenance betrayed no sign of pleasure at sight of his visitor, and his greeting was courteous rather than cordial. Overcoming the sudden realization that his errand would certainly be regarded as a piece of presumption, Mr. Allendale opened the interview by saying, with a stiffness engendered by his determination not to truckle to his siren's guardian, "You may wonder, my lord, why I'm here." "No," said the Earl. There was nothing particularly daunting about this calm monosyllable, but it threw Mr. Allendale quite out of his stride. His carefully composed speech of explanation had to be abandoned, and he could not immediately decide what to say in its stead. "Pray be seated, Mr. Allendale," invited his host, himself strolling towards a chair.
Mr. Allendale hesitated. On the whole, he preferred to remain on his feet, but it was difficult to do so while the Earl sat at his ease, one leg cased in an elegant Hessian boot thrown over the other, and one hand, even now, raising his quizzing-glass to his eye. Mr. Allendale sat down and cleared his throat. "I shall be brief," he stated. "It cannot, I fancy, be unknown to your lordship that I have been so fortunate as to engage the interest of Lady Letitia Merion." A flicker of amusement crossed the Earl's eyes. "I understand that the violence of your mutual feelings is such as must melt all but the hardest of hearts. Mine, I am informed, is of marble." Colouring, Mr. Allendale replied, "I am aware, my lord, that the affection I bear Lady Letitia must appear to you in the light of an encroaching fancy." "Oh, no," said Cardross. "I am really not as high in the instep as you seem to think. I don't deny that I should prefer her to make what passes in the world for a good match, but I assure you, if your affections stand the test of time, you won't find me ill-disposed towards you." This very reasonable speech added nothing to Mr. Allendale's comfort. He said heavily, "I am obliged to you, sir. I might remind you that the attachment between us was formed more than a year ago, and has been but strengthened by the passage of time, but I shall not do so." "As we see," murmured Cardross dryly. "The force of your objection is fully felt by me," continued Mr. Allendale, embarking on one of his rehearsed periods. "It might well be thought that Lady Letitia is as yet too young to be permitted to follow the dictates of her heart. Moreover, no one is more conscious than I that in doing so she would be held, in vulgar parlance, to have thrown herself away." "Yes, well, do let us talk in vulgar parlance," begged Cardross. "Not to wrap the matter up in clean linen, my sister is a foolish chit with a turn for the high romantical, and you, my dear sir, are not very much wiser. Her fortune apart, and you need not tell me that you wish her fortune at Jericho, because I acquit you of hanging out for a rich wife. I can conceive of few more unsuitable partners for a man in your position. You have your career before you. I wish you very well, and in proof of this I can only advise you not to saddle yourself with an extravagant and shatterbrained little puss for a wife."
Considerably taken aback by this forthright speech, Mr. Allendale could think of nothing better to say than, "Am I to understand, then, that you refuse your consent to our betrothal, sir?" "For the present, most certainly you are," returned the Earl. "You look to be a man of sense, so you will not, I hope, accuse me of cruelty. I have not said, nor shall I, that I will never give my consent. I don't even say that you must wait until Letty comes of age, but do, I beg you, consider my position in this. Can you feel that I should honourably have fulfilled my charge if I allowed a chit who has not yet reached her 18th year to tie herself up in matrimony to a young man in your circumstances?" "No," said Mr. Allendale bleakly. The Earl was conscious of an impulse to retract, even to bestow his blessing on the lovers. He quelled it, saying cheerfully, "Of course you cannot. But if, in a couple of years' time, you are both still of the same mind, and you come to me again with this proposal, I must be hard-hearted indeed to refuse my consent." "I do not anticipate being in England in a couple of years' time," said Mr. Allendale, more bleakly still. "It was my intention to have explained to your lordship at the outset that I was emboldened to come to you today by the circumstance of my having been appointed to a very advantageous post. I owe this advancement in part to the kind offices of Lord Roxwell, who was formerly much attached to my father, and I have every reason to expect that it will lead, should I acquit myself creditably, to more rapid promotion than has hitherto seemed probable. I am sure you will acquit yourself admirably, and must beg leave to congratulate you on your good fortune. I collect that you are to join one of our embassies." "Yes, sir. I am appointed, that is to say, I shall, within the next 3 months, be appointed to the staff of our minister at the court of the Regent of Portugal." "The Regent of Portugal?" repeated Cardross. "But he is in Brazil." Mr. Allendale inclined his head. "Just so, sir," he agreed. "Good God!" ejaculated Cardross. "Were you proposing in all seriousness to take Letty to South America? You must be mad." "She assures me," said Mr. Allendale earnestly, "that she would like it above all things." "And what the devil do you imagine she knows about it?" demanded Cardross. "Well, I am credibly informed," offered Mr. Allendale, "that the climate at Rio de Janeiro is salubrious." "Oh, take a damper," said Cardross impatiently. "Did this cork-brained notion come out of your head or hers? Did she persuade you to come here today, or—" "No, of course she did. You, at least, cannot have supposed that there was the least likelihood of my consenting to such a preposterous scheme." "No," said Mr. Allendale, "I must own that I had little hope of obtaining your lordship's consent. I am aware that in your eyes the scheme must seem preposterous." "And how does it seem in yours?" inquired the Earl, curiously. "You have been acquainted with my sister for more than a year, after all." "Were it not for your lordship's refusal to entertain my proposal, I should have no hesitation in asking Lady Letitia to accompany me, as my wife, to Brazil." "The devil you wouldn't!" "I believe her to be equal to anything," said Mr. Allendale reverently. "When I first learned of the appointment, I confess that the very natural feeling of delight I experienced was instantly tempered, I might almost say dissipated, by the same doubt of which your lordship is conscious. I could not believe that a delicately nurtured female, and one, moreover, of such tender years, could contemplate without dismay the several evils attaching to the appointment. The discomforts of a long sea voyage, the going amongst foreigners, the separation from her relations. I promise you, sir, every disagreeable possibility that presented itself to my mind was at once communicated to her by me. But nothing was ever like her spirit. What inconveniences there may be she will not regard, and although I do not anticipate that there is any danger to be apprehended, that she would meet with the same trust and courage which she shows in being willing to bestow her hand upon one whose prosperity must depend upon his own exertions." The thought of this nobility overcame him so much that his voice thickened, and he was obliged to blow his nose. Its effect upon Cardross was to exasperate him into saying, with a snap, "I suppose she told you so?" "Yes," replied Mr. Allendale simply. "Did she also work on you to come here today with your fantastic proposal?" "She certainly thought that, with my advancement now secured, we might hope for some relenting on your part," admitted Mr. Allendale. The Earl looked him over somewhat grimly. "But you did not think so, Mr. Allendale, did you?" "Well, it appears to me, my dear sir, that you are as wax in my sister's hands. It is a reflection which fills me with deep misgiving. I know Letty to be as headstrong as she is bird-witted, and what she may next bully or bewitch you into doing, there is no saying, though I might hazard a guess." "If you mean, sir, that I might be tempted to elope with Lady Letitia, you may be easy," returned Mr. Allendale, reddening. "Even if I were not a man of honour, my circumstances must forbid me to embark on anything of a clandestine nature." He drew a breath, and continued with a little difficulty. "You were kind enough, my lord, to acquit me of hanging out, as you phrased it, for a rich wife. That is true, for in fact I had not, until I met Lady Letitia, any thought of marriage at all. My widowed parent, though possessed of a respectable jointure, is quite unable to support the expense of educating my younger brothers and sisters without my assistance, and until they are established creditably, I must not, indeed I cannot, marry a female who has no fortune of her own, just a genteel fortune to match my own. I never contemplated marriage to a great heiress, and to own the truth, it is not what I like. However, I dare say it may be possible to form some kind of a trust which would ensure that I should not benefit by anything more than a reasonable amount." "The matter is not of pressing importance," said the Earl. "Until she reaches the age of 25, my sister's fortune is in my hands, and her allowance is at my discretion. If I chose to do it, I could cut off every penny of it." "I cannot believe, sir, that you would be guilty of such inhumanity," said Mr. Allendale, in a voice of strong censure. "There would be no inhumanity," replied Cardross coolly. "Letty would merely be obliged to continue living in my house, and her dress bills would be paid by me. I may add that I already pay quite a number of them. I am afraid you would find her very expensive, for she never has a feather to fly with, you know." "I am aware that she has not been taught habits of economy," said Mr. Allendale stiffly. "Indeed, she has told me so herself, and has regretted it. She is very willing to learn, and I hope to teach her to manage better." "Yes, in my more optimistic moments I too indulge that hope," agreed Cardross. "Go and take up this appointment of yours, and I'll engage to do my best to instil some small knowledge of economy into her head while you are away. Who knows? You may return to find her quite prudent." Mr. Allendale rose and walked over to the window. He said, staring out of it, "I do not imagine that it will be of any use to return. Not, of course, that I contemplate passing the rest of my life in Brazil, but—" He stopped and cleared his throat. "I cannot flatter myself that I shall find her still unattached. So much sought after, and by men of far greater address than will ever be mine, separated from me for a prolonged period, and by such a distance. No, it would be too much to expect of her. She will wed another." "The same fate may as easily overtake you, my dear sir," remarked the Earl. "No," said Mr. Allendale baldly. He added, after a pause, "My feeling is unalterable. I am not subject to fits of gallantry, sir. I had even believed myself to be proof against... But from the moment when I first saw your sister, I knew myself lost. I struggled against it, for the unsuitability of the match was as plain to me as it is to you. It was to no avail. I shall never marry any other lady." "Ah," murmured the Earl, looking amused. "I remember that I said much the same thing myself a good many years ago. She was ravishingly beautiful. At least, I know I thought so, though, to own the truth, I can now only vaguely recall her face to my mind." "I am happy to afford your lordship entertainment," said Mr. Allendale, in rather less measured accents. "No, you are not," replied Cardross, rising. "You would like to plant me a facer, and I'm sure I don't wonder at it. Nothing is more exasperating than to be obliged to listen to advice based on experience which is necessarily wider than your own, particularly when you have an uneasy suspicion that it may be good." "I have no such suspicion," instantly retorted Mr. Allendale. "I venture to think that my nature is more tenacious than your lordship's." "In that case," said Cardross, with unimpaired good humour, "I shall expect to see you again upon your return from Rio de Janeiro. In the meantime, accept my best wishes for your success in that salubrious locality." "Do you forbid me to hold further communication with Lady Letitia, sir?" demanded Mr. Allendale, somewhat reluctantly taking the hand that was being held out to him. "My dear sir, do let me assure you that I am neither so Gothic nor so cork-brained. I dare say you will meet Letty at any number of parties. As for clandestine meetings, I am persuaded that your sense of propriety must be safeguard enough." "Anything of a clandestine nature is repugnant to me," stated Mr. Allendale. "I can only beg of you, sir, to consider well before you blight, perhaps forever, the happiness of two persons, one of whom is, or should be, dear to you. I reject, indeed I scorn, your suggestions of inconstancy, but too well do I know the arts that are employed in the world of fashion to detach from an unworthy object the affections of such as Lady Letitia. All is sacrificed to pride and consequence. If I were in more affluent circumstances, I believe no considerations of propriety could avail to prevent me. But it serves no purpose to continue talking." "None whatsoever," agreed Cardross, leading the way to the door. "It might even lead me to take you in dislike, and that, you know, would be fatal to your chances." Chapter 3. Any scheme of intercepting her lover on his way out of the house, which Letty might have cherished, was frustrated by the Earl's escorting him to the front door and seeing him safely off the premises. He strolled back to the library, and after hesitating for a moment or two at the head of the stairs, from which post of vantage she had watched Mr. Allendale's departure, Letty ran lightly down, and herself entered the library. Cardross was engaged in mending a pen, but he looked up, and when he saw his half-sister backed against the door, an urgent question in her speaking eyes, abandoned his task. A laugh quivered in his voice as he said, "Letty, you goose! Did you really think that I should succumb to that unfortunate young man's oratory? Do forgive me, but surely he is a very dull dog." "I don't care for that," she said, swallowing a sob. "He is not dull to me. I love him." "You must do so indeed. I should have supposed him to be the last man to take your fancy too." "Well, he is not, and even if you are my guardian, I won't submit to having my husband chosen for me by you." "Certainly not. It's plain I should make a poor hand at it." Hope gleamed in her eyes. She moved towards him and laid a coaxing hand on his arm.
"Dear Giles, if you please, may I marry him?"
He gave the hand a pat, but said, "Why, yes, Letty, when you are older."
"But, Giles, you don't understand. He is going away to Brazil."
"So he informed me."
"Are you thinking that perhaps it might not suit me to live there? I believe the climate is perfectly healthy."
"Salubrious," he interpolated.
"Yes, and in any event I am never ill. You may ask my aunt if it's not so."
"I am sure it is. Don't let us fall into another exhausting argument. I have already endured a great deal of eloquence today, but it would take much more than eloquence to make me consent to your marriage to an indigent young man who proposes to take you to the other end of the world before you are 18 or have been out a year."
"That doesn't signify, and although I own it would be imprudent to marry Jeremy if I were indigent too, I am not indigent, so that's of no consequence either."
"I promise you I shan't refuse my consent on that head if, when he returns from Brazil, you still wish to marry him."
"And what if some odious, designing female has lured him into marrying her?" she demanded.
"He assures me that his nature is tenacious, so we must hope that he will be proof against all designing females," he replied lightly.
"You don't hope that? You don't wish me ever to marry him?"
"No, of course I don't. Good God, child, how could I wish you to throw yourself away so preposterously? Far less help you to do it when you are hardly out of the schoolroom."
"If he were a man of rank and fortune, you wouldn't say I was too young."
"If he were a man of rank and fortune, my dear, he would not be taking up a post as some kind of secretary in Rio de Janeiro. But if it comforts you at all, I don't wish to see you married to anyone for a year or two yet."
"Oh, don't talk to me as if I were a silly little child," she cried passionately.
"Well, I don't think you are very wise," he said.
"No, perhaps I am not wise, but I am not a child, and I know my own mind. You aren't very wise either if you think I shall change it, or forget Jeremy. I shall remember and be unhappy for 2 whole years, and very likely more. I dare say you don't care for that, for I see that you aren't kind, which I thought you were, but, on the contrary, perfectly heartless."
"Not a bit of it," he said cheerfully. "With the best will in the world to do it, I fancy you won't fall quite into dejection. There will still be balls to attend, and new and extremely expensive dresses to buy."
"I don't want them."
"I wish I might believe you. Do you mean to abjure the fashionable life?" She threw him a smouldering look.
"You may laugh at me, but I warn you, Cardross, I am determined to marry Jeremy. Do what you will to prevent me."
He replied only with an ironical bow, and after staring defiantly at him for an instant, she swept from the room with an air of finality only marred by the unfortunate circumstance of her shutting a fold of her gown of delicate lilac muslin in the door, and being obliged to open it again to release the fabric. 20 minutes later, Nell came softly into the room. The Earl looked up impatiently, but when he saw his wife standing on the threshold, his expression changed, and he smiled at her, saying in a funning tone, "How do you contrive, Nell, always to appear prettier than I remembered you?" She blushed adorably.
"Well, I did hope you would think I looked becomingly in this gown," she confessed naively.
"I do. Did you put it on to dazzle me into paying for it?"
This was said so quizzically that her spirits rose. It had taken a great deal of resolution to bring her to the library that morning, for a most unwelcome missive had been delivered by the penny post. Since the Earl paid 5 shillings to the General Post Office every quarter for the privilege of receiving an early London delivery, Madame Laval's civil reminder to her ladyship that a court dress of Chantilly lace was still unpaid for had lain on Nell's breakfast tray. It was not an encouraging start to the day.
It had quite destroyed Nell's appetite, and had filled her with so much frightened dismay that for an unreasoning hour she could think of no other way out of her difficulties than to board the first mail coach bound for Devonshire, and there to seek refuge with her mamma. A prolonged period of reflection, however, showed her the unwisdom of this course, and convinced her that since it was extremely unlikely that a thunderbolt would descend mercifully upon her head, there was nothing for it but to make a clean breast of the matter to Cardross, devoutly trusting that he would understand how it had come about that she had forgotten to give him Madame Laval's bill with all the others which he had commanded her to produce. But the more she thought of it, the less likely it seemed that he could possibly understand. She felt sick with apprehension, recalling his stern words. He had asked her if she was quite sure she had handed all her bills to him. He had warned her of the awful consequences if he found she had lied to him, and although he had certainly begged her later not to be afraid of him, it was not to be expected that he would greet with equanimity the intelligence that his wife had overlooked a bill for 335 guineas. It even seemed improbable that he would believe she really had overlooked it. She herself was aghast at her carelessness. She was so sure that she had given the bill to Cardross with all the others collected from a drawer crammed with them, that her first thought on seeing Madame Laval's renewed demand was that that exclusive modiste had erred. But an agitated search had brought the previous demand to light, wedged at the very back of the drawer. It was by far the heaviest single item amongst her debts, casting into the shade the milliner's bill which had staggered Cardross. What he would say she dared not consider, even less what he might do. At the best, he must believe her to be woefully extravagant, which indeed she knew she had been, and he would be very angry, though forgiving. At the worst... But to speculate on what he might do at the worst was so fatal to resolution that she would not let herself do it. With a childlike hope of pleasing him, she had arrayed herself in a gown which she knew, on the authority of that arbiter of taste, Mr. Heatherset, became her to admiration. It had instantly won for her a charming compliment, and she was now able to reply, not without pride, "No, it is paid for." She added honestly, after a moment's reflection, "You paid for it." "It is a great satisfaction to me to know that I didn't waste my money," he said gravely, but with laughter in his eyes. This was a much more promising start to the interview than she had expected. She smiled shyly at him, and was just about to embark on a painful explanation of her new embarrassment, when he said, "Are you Letty's envoy, then? I own I might listen with more patience to you than to her, but on this subject I am determined to remain adamant." Not sorry to be diverted from her real errand, she said, "Of course, I do see that it would be throwing herself away quite shockingly, but I believe you will be obliged in the end to consent. Well, I thought myself that it was just a fancy that would pass when she had seen more of society and had met other gentlemen. But it isn't so, Cardross. She hasn't swerved from her devotion to Mr. Allendale, even though she has been made up to by I don't know how many others, and all of them," she added reflectively, "of far greater address than poor Mr. Allendale." "Nell," he interrupted, "can you tell me what she perceives in that dead boar to dote upon?" She shook her head. "No, there's no accounting for it," she replied. "She doesn't know either, which is what makes me feel that it is a case of true love, and certainly no passing fancy." "They are totally unsuited," he said impatiently. "She would ruin him in a year, what's more. She is as extravagant as you are, my love." He saw the stricken look in her face, the colour ebbing from her cheeks, and instantly said, "What an unhandsome thing to say to you. I beg your pardon. That is all forgotten, a page which we have stuck down and shan't read again."
My dear Nell, if you could but have heard that absurd young man addressing me in flowing periods this morning. Do you know that he proposed in all seriousness to carry Letty off to Brazil?" Her thoughts were very far from Letty's affairs, but she answered mechanically, "Yes, she told me of his appointment." He regarded her with a slight crease between his brows. "You are looking very troubled now. Why? Are you taking this nonsense to heart?" Now, if ever, was the moment to tell him that the page had not yet been stuck down. The words refused to be uttered. She said instead, "I can't help but be sorry for them. I know it is a bad match, and indeed, Cardross, I understand what your sentiments must be." "I imagine you might. To be wishing Letty joy of a shockingly bad bargain would be fine conduct in a guardian. To own the truth, I wish I were not her guardian, or that I had never permitted her aunt to take charge of her. That woman wants both manner and sense, and, as far as I can discover, reared her own daughters as well as my sister in a scrambling way, encouraging them in every extravagant folly, and allowing them to set up their flirts when they should have been in the schoolroom." "Well, yes," admitted Nell. "I don't like to abuse her, for she is always very civil and good-natured, but she does seem to be sadly shatterbrained. But I can't suppose that she encouraged Mr. Allendale, for she doesn't at all wish Letty to marry him, you know. She talked to me about it the other evening at the Westburys' drum, and she seemed to feel just as she ought." She paused, considering this. "At least," she amended, "just as you think she ought, Cardross." He was amused. "Indeed? But not as you think, I collect." "Well, not precisely," she temporized. "I must say it has me quite in a puzzle to understand how it comes about that such a lively girl should fall in love with Mr. Allendale, for he is not at all sportive, and he doesn't seem to have more than common sense, besides having such very formal manners. But there is nothing in his disposition to make him ineligible, is there? I mean, it isn't as if she wished to marry someone like Sir Jasper Lydney or young Brixworth, and one wouldn't have felt the least surprise if she had, because they have both been dangling after her ever since she came out, and no one can deny that they have very engaging manners, in spite of being such shocking rakes. You would not have liked her to marry either of them." "I should not. But there is a vast gulf between Brixworth and Allendale, my love. As for eligibility, though there may be nothing in Allendale's disposition to dislike, there is nothing in his circumstances to recommend him. He has neither rank nor fortune." "Letty doesn't care for rank, and she has fortune," Nell pointed out. "Unequal marriages rarely prosper. Letty may imagine she doesn't care for rank. She doesn't know how it would be to marry a man out of her own order." Nell wrinkled her brow over this. "But, Giles, I think she does know," she objected. "For it is not as if she had been accustomed all her life to move only in circles of high fashion. Mrs. Thorne is perfectly respectable, but not at all exclusive. And you yourself told me that Letty's mamma was not of the first rank." "You are a persuasive advocate, Nell, but I must hold to my opinion, and to what I conceive to be my duty. I have said that I won't withhold my consent if both are of the same mind when Allendale returns from Brazil, and that must suffice them. I shan't conceal from you that I hope Letty by that time will have transferred her affections to some more worthy object." "You want her to make a good match, don't you?" "Is that so wonderful?" "Oh, no. Perhaps, if she doesn't see Mr. Allendale for some years, she will do so. Only, it would be so very melancholy." "My dear child, why?" She tried haltingly to express the thought in her mind. "She loves him so much, and I cannot think that she would be happy if she married only to oblige her family." His brows had drawn together. He said harshly, "As you did." She stared at him almost uncomprehendingly. As I did?" she faltered. A smile, not a very pleasant smile, curled his lips. "Had I not been possessed of a large fortune, you wouldn't have married me, would you now?" She was conscious of a pain at her heart, but she heard him without resentment. She thought of her debts and of those mysterious settlements, and could only be thankful that she had not disclosed to him Madame Laval's bill. Its existence weighed so heavily upon her conscience that she found herself unable to utter a word. A deep flush stained her cheeks, and her eyes, after a hurt moment, dropped from his. "You must forgive me." His voice had an ironical inflection that made her wince. "My want of delicacy sinks me quite below reproach, doesn't it? I fancy it gave Allendale a disgust of me, too." She managed to say in a stifled tone, I didn't know about your fortune." "Didn't you?" he said lightly. "How charming of you, my dear. Your manners make mine appear sadly vulgar. Don't look so distressed. I am persuaded no man ever had so beautiful, so polite, or so amiable a wife as I have." He glanced at his watch. "I must go. I don't know what nonsense Letty may have taken into her head, but I hope I may trust you not to encourage her in it. Happily, it appears to be out of Allendale's power to marry her without a substantial portion. She's under age, of course, but I'd as lief not be saddled with that kind of scandal." A smile, a brief bow, and he was gone, leaving her with her brain in a whirl. There was little thought of Letty in it. For the first time in their dealings, Cardross had hinted that he had looked for more than complaisance in his wife, and his words, with their edge of bitterness, had made Nell's heart leap. It was almost sacrilege to doubt Mamma, but was it, in fact, possible that Mamma had been wrong? She went slowly upstairs, to be pounced on by Letty, bursting with indignation and the desire to unburden herself. She listened with half an ear to that impassioned damsel, saying yes and no at suitable moments, but assimilating little from the molten discourse, beyond the warning that her sister-in-law would be forced to take desperate measures if Cardross continued on his present tyrannical course. Before it had dawned on Letty that she had no very attentive auditor to the tale of her wrongs, a message was brought up to the drawing-room that the Misses Thorne had called to take up their cousin on a visit to some exhibition. Nell soon found herself alone, and at leisure to consider her own problems. These very soon resolved themselves into one problem only: how to pay for a court dress of Chantilly lace without applying to Cardross. If Cardross had offered for her hand, not as a matter of convenience, but for love, this was of vital importance. Nothing could more surely confirm his suspicion than to be confronted with that bill, and any attempt to tell him that she had fallen in love with him at their first meeting must seem to him a piece of quite contemptible cajolery. No solution to the difficulty had presented itself to her by the time the butler came in to inform her that the barouche had been driven up to the door and awaited her convenience. She was tempted to send it away again, and was only prevented from doing so by the recollection that civility obliged her to make a formal call in Upper Berkeley Street to inquire after the progress of an ailing acquaintance. She directed the coachman on the way back to drive to Bond Street, where she had a few trifling purchases to make, and there, strolling along, with his beaver set at a rakish angle on his golden head, and his shapely legs swathed in pantaloons of an aggressive yellow, she saw her brother. The Viscount had never been known to extricate himself from his various embarrassments, much less anyone else. But to his adoring sister he appeared in the light of a strong ally. She called to the coachman to pull up, and when Dysart crossed the street in response to her signal, leaned forward to clasp his hand, saying thankfully, "Oh, Di, I am so glad to have met you. Will you be so very obliging as to come home with me? There is something I particularly wish to ask you." "If you're wanting me to escort you to some horrible squeeze," began the Viscount suspiciously, "I'll be dashed if I—" "No, no, I promise you it's no such thing," she interrupted. I need your advice." "Well, I don't mind giving you that," said his lordship, handsomely. "What's the matter? You in a scrape?" "Good gracious, no," said Nell, acutely aware of her footman, who had jumped down from the box and was now holding open the door of the barouche. "Do get in, Di. I'll tell you presently." "Very well," he said, stepping into the carriage and disposing himself on the seat beside her. "I've nothing else to do, after all."